Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Sallallahu sallam wa barak ala Nabi Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajmain. So welcome as always to the Monday meeting, and as always we thank you for taking time out of your Monday evening, usually an evening where people are tired because it's the first day of work after the weekend and they want nothing more than to just relax. So we appreciate you taking time out of your Monday evening to be with us, to remind ourselves of our duty to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the rights that He has upon us, and how we're supposed to conduct and behave and carry ourselves as Muslims. So last week, the topic of our meeting was ad-dawah ila Allah. And in that meeting we addressed the following points. What is ad-dawah, and what does it mean to call to Allah? Number two, what is ruh ad-dawah? What is the spirit of da'wah and its lifeblood? Number three, what is the incentive to engage in da'wah? Why should we care about it? Why should we concern ourselves with doing it? And last but not least, we talked about who should do da'wah, and what does this discussion have to do with us, the laymen. So today, inshallah ta'ala, we will look at the founding principles or basic guidelines for giving da'wah, derived from some important religious texts, or some texts which specifically speak to the parameters, the guidelines, the requirements for a da'wah. The first text we're going to look at is from Surah Yusuf, the 12th surah of the Quran, verse number 108, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, قُلْ هَذِهِ سَبِيلِي أَدْعُو إِلَى اللَّهِ عَلَى بَصِيرَةٍ أَنَا وَمَنِ اتَّبَعَنِي وَسُبْحَانَ اللَّهِ وَمَا أَنَا مِنَ الْمُشْرِكِينَ. Say, this is my way. I invite unto Allah with clear vision. I do, and likewise do those who follow me. Glory be to Allah. I am not from those who associate partners with Allah, nor do I fraternize with the idolaters. And as I said, this is verse 108 from Surah 12, Surah Yusuf. So if you notice in this verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says a few things, and each one of those things gives us a guideline. Something that we have to be mindful of and pay attention to and observe in the process of giving a da'wah. So he says, first of all, he says, قُلْ هَذِهِ سَبِيلِي. He says, this is my way. He uses the word sabil, which is the singular. So this is my one way. It's one and only way. So Allah is telling us Islam is one. And it's not a multitude of Islams that we are allowed to pick and choose from to call to. Everybody has their own version of Islam, their own spin on Islam, their own perspective on Islam, and they can just call to that. No. Allah is saying, قُلْ هَذِهِ سَبِيلِي. Say, this is my way. One way. And that's what I call to. One way. Then by that he says, أَدْعُو إِلَى اللَّهِ. I call unto Allah. I call unto Allah, not my own personal opinions, perceptions, or practice. And to do that, if I call to my own perception, my own practice, I call to an Islam of my own making, that would be to invite to a religion of our own making and not the religion of Allah. We talked about that a little bit last week. And there are many people, unfortunately, when they give da'wah, they call themselves calling to Allah. They call people to their own personal perspective, their own practice of Islam. Islam as they see it. Islam as they practice it, not Islam as revealed to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Allah is saying when He says, قُلْ هَذِهِ سَبِيلِي أَدْعُو إِلَى اللَّهِ. Say, this is my path, I call to Allah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, don't do this. Don't call to your perspective. Don't call to Islam as you see it, but rather call unto Allah and unto Allah's way of believing and behaving. And I'll give you some examples. For example, there may be a Muslim who eats pulled pork sandwiches. And he has a colleague or a classmate or a neighbor who's interested in Islam and happens to be in his company or presence or see him from time to time going to X restaurant buying pulled pork sandwiches. And he says, hey, I thought Muslims aren't supposed to eat pork. I thought it was not permitted in your religion for Muslims to eat pork. And that person responds, instead of saying, yeah, pork is prohibited in our religion, calling to what? To Allah, what Allah says. He says Islam is about what's in your heart, not what you do. Rituals and eating halal are things followed by backward, old-fashioned Muslims, not progressive ones. Not people who are living in the now. These are the people who are living what? In the Middle Ages. He says this. When he says this, he's not calling to Allah, he's calling to what? His own personal perspective, and he's presenting an Islam, or presenting Islam in a way that makes him look observant, instead of looking non-observant. Makes him look like he's not committing a sin, when in reality, he is. He's more concerned about how he's going to look, or making himself feel good, as opposed to presenting the deen of Allah. Like another example. Muslim sister, she abandons hijab and dresses immodestly. Or there's a family full of ladies, mother and daughters, none of them wear hijab. And they have a neighbor who's interested in Islam, been doing some reading maybe, and that person says, I noticed you don't wear a headscarf. And your attire is similar to that worn by liberal Western women. You're wearing clothing like anybody else, any Western woman. If somebody saw you outside, they wouldn't even know you were a Muslim. And I'm curious about that because I've been reading a lot about Islam and reading about this thing called hijab. Right? I've been reading about that. And I thought the headscarf and modest clothing was a fundamental Islamic tenet. It's like, it's hand in hand with Islam, part and parcel with Islam. A Muslim woman is supposed to cover and dress modestly. That's what I thought from what I was reading. And I also thought it was a huge symbol, a major symbol of commitment. It's a clear sign that a Muslim woman is committed to Islam because she's wearing hijab. Am I mistaken in that? So this woman has an opportunity. An opportunity to call to who? Allah. To call to Allah. But instead, she says, hijab is not for every woman. Hijab is not for every woman. Not every woman is expected to wear it. It is reserved for women who are married, over 40, and have made pilgrimage, and therefore they are held to a higher standard. But women who can't check these boxes, they don't have to wear hijab. Is this calling to Allah? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah An-Nur, He says, وَقُلْ لِلْمُؤْمِنَاتِ يَغْضُضْنَ مِنْ أَبْصَارِهِنَّ وَيَحْفَظْنَ فُرُوجَهُنَّ وَلَا يُبْدِينَ زِينَتَهُنَّ إِلَّا مَا ظَهَرَ مِنْهَا وَلْيَضْرِبْنَ بِخُمُرِهِنَّ عَلَى جُيُوبِهِنَّ وَلَا يُبْدِينَ زِينَتَهُنَّ إِلَّا مَا ظَهَرَ مِنْهَا. Allah says in the Quran, in Surah An-Nur, He says, and say, O Muhammad, to the believing women. Believing women over 40? Believing women who have made pilgrimage? Believing women who are married? No, believing women. Every woman who calls herself a mu'minah, a believing woman, this khitab, this address applies to her. So it's either you believe in it or you don't. But these exceptions are not in the Quran. Allah says, O Muhammad, say to the believing women, young and old, married and unmarried, those who have made pilgrimage and those who haven't made pilgrimage, يَغْضُضْنَ مِنْ أَبْصَارِهِنَّ, to lower their gaze and to guard their chastity, guard their modesty. وَلَا يُبْدِينَ زِينَتَهُنَّ إِلَّا مَا ظَهَرَ مِنْهَا. They shouldn't reveal from their charms and adornments except that which must normally appear thereof. Then He says, وَلْيَضْرِبْنَ بِخُمُرِهِنَّ, and let them take their headscarves and cast them down over their heads and across, covering their bosoms. This is for who? The believing women. This woman had a chance to call to Allah, but chose to call to what? To herself. To say that which made her feel comfortable, made her feel less ashamed, made her feel better instead of what? Doing what was right by Allah and saying, hey, yeah, It's part of the deen. I'm just not practicing it. So calling to Allah, brothers and sisters, requires answering these questions and other questions like them in accordance with the teachings of Allah. Even if that makes us look bad or not observant. A person smokes and somebody asks him about Islam, is it okay to smoke in Islam? He doesn't say, yeah, it's alright. Nothing wrong with it. He says, yeah, it's haram. It's a weakness for me. It's an addiction for me. He just admits it. He puts the blame on himself, the fault on himself, not the fault on what? On Islam. But we have to be less concerned about our own images and more concerned with presenting an accurate image or accurate presentation, an accurate picture of Islam. But ثم بعد ذلك, Allah goes on to say, على بصيرة. I call with clear vision. What that means according to scholars of Islam, I call with knowledge. Before I open my mouth, I make sure I know what I'm going to say is right. I have to have the knowledge. Before we can call to Islam, we have to know Islam. We have to attain the knowledge, the credible knowledge from credible sources. And that doesn't mean, brothers and sisters, that we have to know Islam from A to Z. We have to have an encyclopedic knowledge of Islam in order to preach Islam. But rather, before we give da'wah, we have to have sufficient knowledge of whatever we're going to talk about from three angles. The first thing is we have to have al-ilmu bima nad'u ilayh. We have to have the knowledge of what we're calling to. So for example, if a person is going to call to at-tawheed, the oneness of Allah, and suffice themselves with that, they should know what that means. What is a tawheed? They should know us, have a sufficient knowledge about the tawheed, and then speak in accordance with that knowledge. Don't go beyond that knowledge. So we have to have knowledge of what we're calling to. Knowledge of Islam generally, and knowledge of the specific things we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about hijab, for example. You have to know something about hijab. So for example, you have people who think that hijab is just what? The headscarf. So you cover your hair and your head and your neck and everything else. It doesn't matter. They think that. Well, those people can't call to hijab because they don't know what hijab is. They have to have the knowledge first and then call. ثم بعد ذلك العلم بكيفية ad-dawah. They have to know the proper method, the proper way to give da'wah. Why? Because da'wah is an ibadah. It's an act of worship. And since it's an act of worship, there's a certain way it has to be done, like every other act of worship. And since there's a certain way that it has to be done, we need to know what that way is. We need to know what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And then we also have to know or have some knowledge, al-ilmu bihal al-mad'u. We have to have some knowledge of the one that we call. So, for example, if you call a rich person, do you think it's the same as calling a poor person? Do you think the approach will be the same? If you're calling an atheist versus a theist, somebody who believes in God and somebody who doesn't believe in God, it's going to be the same? The approach is going to be different. If you're calling a Jew versus a Christian versus a Buddhist, it's going to be the same? The approach is going to be different. So the more you know about the one you're calling, the better and more effective you will be able to call, or effectively you'll be able to call. Let's circle back down to this proper manner of calling, because one of the things that came up last week was a question about a particular jama'ah which engages in da'wah, and whether or not their approach to da'wah is correct, the technique, the method that they use is acceptable. And so it's important for us to have some knowledge of the acceptable methods. One reason, so we don't employ unacceptable methods and have our da'wah thrown back in our face or viewed by Allah as a sin, because we're not doing it the way, this act of worship, the way He prescribed it. Just think about it. If somebody came right now and wanted to offer the prayer Tahiyatul Masjid, they came in here and they turned their back this way and turned their front this way, would that prayer be accepted? Huh? Wouldn't be accepted. But if they came and they were not in wudu and they made salat without wudu, would it be accepted? It would be accepted. As in the hadith of Abdullah, I think it's The hadith of Ubadah ibn Samit. La salata bila tuhur. There's no prayer without purification, without wudu. Al-Muhim, because you don't do the act of worship the way it's supposed to be done, it won't be accepted. Same thing with ad-dawah. So we need to know what methods are acceptable, what methods are not acceptable. Also, the more we know about the acceptable methods, the more we create for ourselves a tool belt. A tool belt of what? Techniques and methods. So when we meet this particular person and we're going to give them da'wah, the tool that we would have used for this other person won't work for this person, but we have another tool that works for them, like we talked about, rich versus poor, atheist versus theist. The more you know about da'wah and the methods and approaches of giving da'wah, the more you know the best tool to use to what? To get at or to convince or to make this person think and reflect and hopefully accept Islam. So I want to give you guys a principle that we can use, because there's lots of techniques that people use. And we can't say all the techniques. We can't say, some people say as-Saafiy, ad-dawah, tawqifiyah. They say that the methods and techniques for giving da'wah, the means for giving da'wah, all of them are something which has to come from Allah. If it's on the Quran and Hadith, you can't use it. Other people say wasa'il ad-da'wah wa asalibiha ghayr tawqifiyah. They say none of them. It's like everything is acceptable. You can do whatever you have to do to get the job done. You can do it in da'wah. Neither one of these extremes is right. It's somewhere in the middle. Some as-Saafiy, some means and methods are acceptable, and some are not acceptable. So how do we distinguish between the two? There's an approach, a principle, a method that Ibn Taymiyyah mentioned in his book. I believe it's Iqtida' as-Sirat al-Mustaqim. And other scholars have mentioned it as well. And that approach is basically we ask a couple of very critical questions. The first question we ask is this technique that we're going to employ, this means or method we're going to use, is it something that could have been used, or it would be used by or useful to the Prophet and his companions? Something that during their time would have been advantageous for them to use this method. That's the first thing we ask. Would they have benefited from this method? So for example, mukabbirat as-sawt, the microphone. Is a microphone a useful tool in da'wah? Yeah, it is. That you can broadcast your message and make it reach more people. Even better than the microphone, social media. Social media, is that a good tool a good tool to use in giving da'wah? Certainly, because you get your message out to more people. And would that have been something advantageous or useful to the Prophet ﷺ? Is that something? Certainly, he could have used and benefited from what? He could have benefited from social media had it been available at his time, right? طيب. The second question we ask, was there any mani'? Was there any obstacle that prevented him from using it? So let's say that the first question we answer, yes. This thing, this technique, this method, this approach, this means would have been useful. It could have been used by, it could have been advantageous for the Prophet and his companions to use it. Yes. The next question we ask, was there anything stopping them from using it? So for example, the mic could have been advantageous, useful for the Prophet, right? To broadcast his message. Was there anything stopping him from using it? Yeah, the technology didn't exist, right? Social media, could the Prophet have used that? Could he have benefited from that? Certainly. Him and his companions. But they couldn't use it. There was a mani', there was something that prevented them. That's what? The technology didn't exist. You guys see that? Like, what about using music as a ways to give da'wah? Using anashid, songs, right? Using songs as a way to bring people to Islam. Melodious songs with beautiful voice, somebody singing a song about loving Allah. Is that something that the Prophet could have used? It was something that could have been advantageous for him. Were there people with beautiful voices during the time of the Prophet? Yes. And would it have been possible for them to compose lyrics about loving Allah and loving the Prophet and longing for Jannah? Could they have done that? So it's something, and it could have been useful. Could have been something that maybe the Prophet could have used to bring people to Islam? Certainly. He could have used it. Is that not so? It could have been advantageous. Was there anything stopping him from using it? Anything stopping him? That was a technological issue, right? It's just about having somebody with a beautiful voice and being able to compose things, right? And those people were poets at that time. Is that not so? So you guys see, so far we got two lanes here. One lane could have been advantageous, but there was something that stopped the Prophet from using it. Another lane could have been advantageous, nothing stopping the Prophet from using it. You guys with me so far? Now we reach to the third question. Did they do it? So, as far as the mic and social media, could have used it, or it would have been advantageous to use it. Something prevented them from using it. Technology, the absence of technology. Did they use it? Of course not, because it wasn't available. In this side, we say what? Checkbox, you can use that. Either because there was a mana, there was something preventing them from using it, or because it wouldn't have been advantageous at that time, but it's advantageous now. You guys see that? What about this other lane, though? Would have been advantageous, could have been useful, could have been made use of, but they chose not to. The Prophet ﷺ could have used music if he wanted to. Could have used singing if he wanted to, but he chose not to. So in that case, not using music becomes what? The sunnah. And using music becomes a prohibited approach, technique, or method, or means of giving a da'wah. You guys see that? And so this is how we can determine what wasa'il, what means and methods are acceptable versus those which are not acceptable. And you have people nowadays who use music in da'wah. They use singing and song in da'wah. They have like people who rap to beats, talking about Islam and saying, yeah, we're calling people to Allah. Like the Prophet could have done that. Nothing's stopping him from doing it. But he chose not to do it, which means what? We shouldn't be using this means or this method. You guys see that? If we follow this approach, our emotions get out of it. And it's just what? It's like a flow chart, right? A plus B equals C. It's a flow chart, right? And that's how we have to approach it, so we make sure that it's not our emotions which are guiding us to what we accept and what we don't accept. So now with that said, we come back to the question that came last week. What about Jama'at at-Tabligh? Who, for example, part of their techniques or their approaches or their means and methods of delivering the da'wah, the messages, they say, for example, we should go out and give da'wah 3 days in a month, 40 days in a year, 4 months in a lifetime. I'm going to ask you honestly, this organization of the da'wah, this scheduling of the delivery of the da'wah, is that something that the Prophet could have done? Is that something that could have been useful for him if it was good and advantageous? Could the Prophet have done that? Certainly. It's good to arrange things and have blocks of time slated for things, isn't it? The Prophet certainly could have used it, and it would have been useful for him to use that. It's possible, right? Was there anything stopping him from doing that? Telling his companions 3 days in a month, 40 days in a year, 4 months in a month. Anything stopping him? Nothing stopping him. Did he do it? He didn't do it. Which means what? This method, this approach, we shouldn't be doing that. Because the Prophet could have done it. It would have been advantageous for him to do it. Nothing stopped him from doing it, but he chose, and his companions chose not to take that approach. But from Ba'dalik, another thing that they do is they focus just on the Muslims. And they say that the Muslims right now, because their condition is so poor, they can't call the non-Muslims. They can only call the Muslims. Meaning, if you were out and about in the mall, dressed up like a Muslim, and somebody came to you and said, hey, I'm interested in Islam, I want to be a Muslim. Based upon what some of these extremists in their group say, you couldn't tell them about Islam. You couldn't call them to Islam. You would have to what? Excuse me, I can't tell you about Islam right now. Muslims' condition is too bad. But you can't call the non-Muslims to Islam. You have to focus only on the Muslims. Now this approach, is this something that the Prophet could have used? Certainly he could have used that. Anything stopping him from just focusing on the people that had become Muslims? or telling his followers, his folks on the Muslims, nothing stopping him. Which means what? This approach is what? It's bid'i. It's something, it's innovative. It's not something that we should apply in da'wah. Let me give you one more from Jamaat Tabligh. Is that when they call to Allah, when they give da'wah, they avoid what they call thorny issues, thorny topics. Those topics which will make certain people uncomfortable and may make them not want to accept the da'wah, according to them. And they consider from among the thorny issues, al-fiqhiyat, the issues of do's and don'ts and rights and wrongs. Do you have to wear a cap when you pray? Does this break your wudu or not? They say we should avoid that. But they also say we should avoid talking about the tawheed, the oneness of Allah, and prohibiting and forbidding a shirk. We shouldn't talk about that because it makes some Muslims uncomfortable because they do some things which could be considered by some shirk or borderline shirk. So let's not talk about that. Let's just talk about loving Allah, loving the Prophet, talk about salat, talk about the virtues of Islam, the virtues of certain deeds and what you'll get if you do those deeds. Let's just talk about that. I'm going to ask you honestly. First of all, what was the crux of the Prophet's message? At-Tawheed. 10 years in Mecca before there was even salat. Formal prayer. All he talked about was At-Tawheed. In Mecca, people fornicated. People drank wine. People committed murder. People lied, they cheated, they stole. The Prophet focused on what? At-Tawheed for 10 years. And that focus, even though it shifted, and he began to start to what? To impose certain rules and regulations. Formal prayer was legislated, fasting, almsgiving, alcohol was prohibited. He still emphasized the Tawheed to the point that on his deathbed, he was telling the people, for example, he said on his deathbed, he said, لا تجعلوا قبري عيدا لا تجعلوا قبري وثنا يعبد من دون الله. Or كما قال صلى الله عليه وسلم. He said, don't make my grave a place that you come and you frequently visit. Don't make my grave a place that you worship besides Allah. He was stressing and emphasizing Tawheed as he was breathing his last breaths. So what Tawheed was the first thing he talked about, the last thing he talked about, and the thing that he talked about throughout his years. And somebody will come and say Tawheed is a thorny issue, we should just what? We should avoid it. Does that make sense? Doesn't make sense. Also, the Prophet could have definitely used this method. It would have been useful for his people, right? Because his people, the reason why they wouldn't accept his message, even though he was the best of them, was because of this Tawheed. They wanted him to stop talking about Tawheed. Stop emphasizing on the oneness of God and the falsehood of the deity. If you do that, we'll put the moon in your right hand and the sun in your left hand, they told him, right? So he could have benefited from what? Not talking so much about Tawheed. And there was nothing stopping him except that it's wrong, right? And so what that tells us is that this approach to da'wah is what? It's wrong. You guys see that? So if we follow this method, we can determine what approaches are acceptable and what approaches are unacceptable in da'wah. So I want to just give real quick a few ala ujala because we want to complete early enough to open the floor for questions and discussion. But I'm just going to give you some examples of some techniques that we should have in our tool belt, some acceptable ones. So one of them is a tadarruj, which is when you give da'wah to people in incremental stages. Another one is being organized and systematic in your approach. That basically you don't just, you don't have all of this information and you just come and you just kind of vomit all the information in a very unorganized fashion that the people can't follow. But rather, no, you deliver your message in a way that's what? Systemic, that makes sense, that they can absorb, understand, comprehend, digest. And also another important technique is al-bada' bil-aham fal-aham, that you begin with the most important thing, and then from that you transition to the next important thing, or the next thing important in terms of importance, and so on and so forth. And all of these three techniques are combined in one hadith. The hadith of Ibn Abbas, in which the Prophet ﷺ, he sent Mu'adh ibn Jabal to Yemen. And he told him, إِنَّكَ تَأْتِي قَوْمًا مِنْ أَهْلِ الْكِتَابِ فَلْيَكُنْ أَوَّلَ مَا تَدْعُوهُمْ إِلَيْهِ شَهَادَةُ أَنْ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهُ وَأَنَّ مُحَمَّدًا رَسُولُ اللَّهِ فإن أطاعوا لك بذلك فأخبرهم أن الله قد فرض عليهم خمس صلوات في كل يوم وليلة فإن أطاعوا لك بذلك فأخبرهم أن الله قد فرض عليهم صدقة تؤخذ من أغنيائهم فترد على فقرائهم إلى آخر الحديث. So in this hadith, the Prophet ﷺ told Mu'adh, he said, you're going to go. He was sending him to Yemen as his emissary, as his ambassador. So you're going to go to some people from the people of the book. They were Christians in Yemen at that time. He said, so let the first thing you call them to be the oneness of Allah. Means what? Al-bada' bil-aham fal-aham. Start with the most important thing. Right? Also a tadarruj. Start with this and don't go to something else until what? Until they really understand this and accept it. He said, فَإِنَ طَاعُوا لَكَ بِذَلِكَ. And if they obey you in that, then tell them about what? About prayer. And if they obey you in that, then tell them about az-zakat, sadaqah. So he's telling them what? Give your da'wah in what? In stages. And also do it what? In a very systematic. Don't go to them and say, oh, in Islam, we have tawheed, we have salat, we have zakat, we have hajj, we have... No, because that's what? That's just too much for them to what? To really comprehend. Start with one thing. Be systematic about your approach. And then go to the next thing and the next thing. And tadarruj. And beginning with the most important thing and then transition to the one that follows it in importance. Another usloob, another tool in our tool belt is actions speak louder. So model the behavior that you want them to follow. Call by doing. And the Prophet used to do that. The famous hadith where Thumama ibn Uthal, he came from Bani Hanifa and he was intending to kill the Prophet ﷺ. He came disguised. He got caught in the outskirts of Medina by a platoon that the Prophet had sent to do some other business. They brought him to the mosque. They tied him to a pillar in the mosque. And obviously the Prophet by this time knows about the plot, either through revelation or through him admitting it. And so he has him there tied to a pillar in his mosque, and he can do what? He can kill him if he wants to. He doesn't. He says, you know, just, what do you have to say for yourself, Thumama? What do you think I'm going to do to you? So Thumama was a little bit arrogant. He said, عندي خير يا محمد إن تقتل ذا دم وإن تنعم على شاكر وإن أردت المال فاسأل منه ما شئت. He said, oh Muhammad, I expect, because you're such a good guy and everybody thinks so highly of you, that you're gonna, I have good expectations of you. If you kill me, you will kill someone who has a tribe that will seek revenge. So you need to think about that. And if you are gracious towards me, you will be gracious towards someone who knows how to give thanks. So don't think that you letting me go will go unrewarded. And if it's money you want, if it's about ransom, okay, I'm a rich man. Ask me whatever you want. So the Prophet left him there for 4 days, 3 or 4 days. And while he's there, what's he seeing in the masjid? What's he seeing in the masjid during the time of the Prophet ﷺ? Think about it. He's seeing a mosque full of people worshiping Allah. He's in the masjid in Maghrib and feeling the masjid reverberate with what? Ameen, right? He's seeing people who used to be at war with each other. Now they're what? Praying side to side. They're laughing and joking. They're saying, how can I help you? How can I assist you? Oh, I lost my camel, or my camel fell down into a ditch. I need help getting it out. Oh, come on. I'm going to call some of my friends and we'll get it. He's seeing all this. He's seeing people come pour to the masjid and giving sadaqah. He's hearing the Prophet give his lectures and how the people sit there كَأَنَّ عَلَى رُوسِهِمْ الطَّيْرِ, as if they're birds on their heads. He's seeing all this. And so at the end of that 3 or 4 days, the Prophet ultimately what? He released him. And you think, he's going to run back before the Prophet changes his mind. No, he comes back after taking a bath and says, stands at the door of the masjid and shouts in a loud voice, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammad Rasulullah. How did a person's heart change from 4 days ago he wants to kill the Prophet to coming now and saying, I want to be a believer? It's because the Prophet and his companions gave da'wah by what? By doing. The Prophet had the same word. They gave da'wah by doing. You guys see that? It's another important method that we believers, and one of the reasons why, and people come to Islam in spite of us, not because of us in many cases. They come to Islam despite us. Think how many people would come to Islam if we lived this life. If we actually were living what we believe in. From the as-Saafiy, visual aids, similitudes, logical, common sense arguments. Common sense arguments, Prophet uses it all the time. Allah uses it in the Quran. We should use it as well. You're up here with your colleagues in university and people who are they're intellectuals. Make them think. Force them to think. As Allah says in the Quran, for example, أَمْ خُلِقُوا مِنْ غَيْرِ شَيْءٍ أَمْ هُمُ الْخَالِقُونَ. Were they created from nothing? Or did they create themselves from nothing? I'm asking you. A logical, sensible person says what? Nothing can create something. And nothing can't create itself into something. You guys see that? So there had to be what? An external force, being that made this happen. You guys see that? How Allah uses logic. We should use logic. Don't want to spend too much time on that, but these are some examples of the tool belt that we need to create for ourselves when we give da'wah. Another text that we should look at as far as some of the guidelines is the statement of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Al-Nahl, verse number 125, which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Udu ila sabili rabbik bil hikmah wal maw'idati al-hasana wajadilhum billati hiya ahsan. Invite all to the path of your Lord with wisdom and beautiful preaching, and debate with them in the best way. So as far as wisdom, scholars of Islam have basically said it's wad'u shay fi mahalli. It is basically putting the right thing in the right place at the right time. And so that means that the caller, he has to exercise good judgment. He has to read the room and determine whether or not enjoining good or forbidding evil or giving da'wah will do more harm than good. And if so, he abandons it. Or he knows that if I use this usloob, it won't be as effective as that usloob. So he uses what? Wisdom. Even though this is my favorite approach, that approach is going to be as effective in this situation. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَالْمَوْعِظَةِ الْحَسَنَةِ, and beautiful preaching, which means it points to two things. One, it points to using the usloob of a targhib or tarheeb. That you encourage people and you incentivize becoming Muslim on one hand. Tell them all the good things they'll get if they become Muslim. How their life will change. How they'll be successful in the hereafter. And what that means in terms of bliss, eternal bliss. And also a tarheeb, discouraging, warning, and threatening them. If you don't accept this message, this is what's going to happen to you. So the Muslim has to do what? Combine between the two. You can't be all tarheeb. Oh, Jannah, oh, but you don't talk about what? A nar. And you can't be all nar, fire and brimstone. You got to what? Combine between the two, couple between the two. And this is how Allah does it in the Quran. And some Muslims say you should never talk about hellfire. Never talk about hellfire. No, we need to talk about hellfire, so we need to be afraid of Allah. But we can't talk about hellfire so much that we lose what? Hope. You guys see that? So that's why you have to have a balance. And that way you have a balance between hope and fear. Hope in Allah's mercy, fear of Allah's punishment. But through this beautiful preaching, it also points to embodying the quality of gentleness, being gentle. The caller, when we call to Allah, we have to realize we can catch more flies with honey than we can with vinegar. And people are more likely to accept the advice and accept our da'wah if we deliver it gently. Which is why the Prophet said in the hadith, he said, إِنَّ اللَّهَ رَفِيقٌ يُحِبُّ الرِّفْقِ يُعْطِي عَلَى الرِّفْقِ مَا لَا يُعْطِي عَلى الْأُنْفِ وَمَا لَا سِوَاهُ or وَعَلَى مَا سِوَاهُ. He said, verily Allah is gentle and He loves gentleness. He gives by way of gentleness what He does not give by way of harshness and any other means. So Allah is going to give us through being gentle what He's not going to give us through being harsh. So when you speak to people and you call them to Islam, whether Muslim or non-Muslim, non-Muslims will call them to Islam. They're already Muslim, but we're calling them to what? To certain aspects of Islam they may not be practicing. So when we call them what? With gentleness. We call them with rifq. We call them with gentleness, leniency. Speak to people in a way that you want to be spoken to, in a way that's more likely to let them or make them accept. One last point, or one last guideline, very important guideline, is patience. So the caller, when you call to Allah, whether you're calling Muslims or non-Muslims, it's not always going to go the way you hoped. Not always going to go as planned. Sometimes people push back, and sometimes they push back in a way which is hurtful. And so what we have to do is not be the people who, when we get that pushback, we just throw up our hands and say, you know what? We got time for this, man. I'm trying to help people. That's how you want to act? Forget it. Can't do that. We have to do what? We have to hunker down, dig our heels in the sand. I'm not going to retreat. I'm going to keep calling to Allah. I'm going to keep taking these bullets for Allah and for the people. We talked about last week that the engine that drives down is compassion. We care enough about the people that we're willing to do what? To take some of this disrespect, some of this insolence, some of this rudeness and crudeness. We'll take those bullets and those shots for Allah and for them, for their sake. And so we have to learn to be patient and to bear some of the harm that comes from calling to Allah. And there's lots of, there's a few ayat to talk about this. We'll mention one of them, Surah Luqman, in which Luqman, he gave advices to his son. In that advice, he told him, he said, Ya bunayya, aqim as-salata wa'mur bil-ma'ruf wanha 'anil munkar wasbir 'ala ma asabak. Inna dhalika min azmi al-umur. So he told him, he said, oh my son, establish the prayer. Enjoin what is right and forbid what is wrong. So now give da'wah. And bear with patience whatever befalls you as a consequence. Not every time you give da'wah are people going to like it. They're not always going to appreciate it. And the sad thing too is that some of the people who appreciate the least are the people you expect the most from them. Right? So for example, you have a brother, you've known him for years. You go way back. And then you give him advice and just flips out, gets mad. Throws a temper tantrum. Could be your spouse, right? Could be your sibling. Somebody who's close to you, knows that your heart's in the right place. They reject the message. Al-Muhim, we have to be patient, right? We have to be patient. And so basically what we learned as far as the end of the talk is that knowledge should precede this da'wah. We have to know something about what we're going to call to. Wisdom and gentleness have to accompany it. While we're giving da'wah, we have to be wise and we have to be gentle. And last but not least, patience should follow it. And before we open for any questions, comments, or critiques, I just want to remind you guys that this weekend, the 5th, Sunday, the Bloodmobile will come, and we expect that there will be a lot of non-Muslim traffic on the masjid grounds for the Bloodmobile. And that's an opportunity for us to do what we've been talking about the last 2 weeks, give da'wah. And we are looking for at least, because it's a 5-hour event, from 10 to 3, we're looking for at least 5 teams of 2. If we get more than 2 per hour, that would be great. But we'd like 5 teams of 2, 1 hour per team, to man the da'wah tent that we're going to set up, give out brochures, give out some refreshments, and have dialogue for those who are interested in having dialogue. If you are interested, if you can commit to 1 hour on Sunday, somewhere between 10 and 3, please email me. I was going to pass a roster around, but you do that and then people write their name and email address and it's illegible and you can't read it, and then what do you do with it? It doesn't do you any good. So you guys have my email, iccprograms@gmail.com. Please email me. I'm committed. I can come anytime. You can schedule me anytime. Or no, I'm only free from this time to this time. I'm creating a roster. I have a few names, but I don't have it completely filled out. We need to get it filled out by Wednesday, no later than Thursday. So again, if you're committed, please email me and tell me, hey, I'm down for the cause, and I'll go ahead and get you scheduled and then send you the schedule so you know when we're expecting you to turn up. The next point that I want to mention is that next week, next Monday, I'll be out of town. And so we'll not have a meeting next Monday, which is the 6th of September. But we will resume the following Monday, which should be the 13th of September. Which brings me to my final point. is that by the time we come back on the 13th of September, Salat al-Maghrib will be about 7:15, 7:20. And so a 7 o'clock start time is not going to work. And if we start an hour earlier, a lot of you won't be able to be here because of your work schedule. And so I consider to be prudent for us at this stage of the year to shift from between Maghrib and Isha. So basically our start time will be after Maghrib, and our class will be conducted between Al-Maghrib and Isha, beginning on Monday, September 13th, if I'm not mistaken. It'll be the 13th. So that'll come out on the WhatsApp group. That'll come out. There'll be an announcement, but we have it here on the social media. We have it here in the class itself. So please, everybody, remember that on September 13th, it's going to be between Maghrib and Isha. We're all on the same page. We know what the start time is. Please make it a point to be here. And with that, we'll bring today's session to a close. Are there any questions, comments, or critiques? Fadli.
I have 3 questions. One is when you talked about modeling the behavior for the person or people that you're giving dawah to. Could you identify that text that you used to talk about the man who was held for 4 days who attempted to assassinate?
So Thumama ibn Uthal, his qissa is mentioned by Bukhari in his Sahih. It's mentioned by Bukhari in his Sahih. And I don't remember which bab it's under, but the qissa is mentioned in Bukhari.
Okay. Could you also, the last text that you mentioned, Surah Al-Nahl.
Al-Nahl, yes.
Could you tell us which verse that was again?
Abshiri. That is Surah Al-Nahl, verse 125. The 16th surah, verse 125.
I have one more.
Uh-huh.
Okay. Could you give us evidence for not engaging in the music?
Evidence for not doing music? The first one is the famous hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ, he said, سَيَكُونُ مِنْ أُمَّتِي أَقْوَامٌ يَسْتَحِلُّونَ الْحِرَةَ وَالْحَرِيرَةَ وَالْخَمْرَةَ وَالْمَعَازِفَ. He said, there's going to be from my people, أقوام, a lot of people who will legalize or seek to legalize. Now, as soon as he says seek to legalize, means whatever's coming after this is legal or illegal? Illegal. Al-Hira. Al-Hira means al-furuj. They're going to seek to legalize illicit sex by calling it by another name. Wal-Harir, silk for men. Wal-Khamra, alcohol. Have I mentioned anything legal yet? Wal-Ma'azif, and musical instruments. All of those are what? Haram. Also, the ayah in Surah Al-Luqman, Mustafa, back me up if I say it wrong, but وَمِنَ النَّاسِ مَنْ يَشْتَرِي لَهُوَ الْحَدِيثِ. Ibn Mas'ud, when he made tafsir of that ayah, talking about lahu al-hadith, from the people are those who purchase foolish talk, wasteful talk, nonsensical talk. He said, Wallahi huwa al-ghina. Wallahi huwa al-ghina. Wallahi huwa al-ghina. Ibn Mas'ud, one of the greatest commentators on the Quran, he said, I swear by Allah, the meaning of lahu al-hadith, nonsensical talk, I swear by Allah, it refers to singing. I swear by Allah, it refers to singing. I swear by Allah, it refers to singing. And there are lots of other evidences that we could give, but one of the strongest evidences is al-ijma', the collective agreement of the scholars that music and musical instruments is what is prohibited. Now, there have been some exceptions in history, like Ibn Hazm, for example. and Al-Ghazali. But those exceptions cannot outweigh what? The collective agreement of the scholars historically. We call those people from Ash-Shawad. We call them Al-Munfarideen. We call them the people who are Mahjuj or Mahjujina bil-Ijma'. They are the people who have been refuted or repudiated by what? By the collective agreement of the scholars. So those are three evidences, and perhaps in a future class we'll give an extensive discussion about it, but those are three evidences which suffice any person who really wants to follow the truth on this issue. And I know a lot of people don't want to follow the truth, they love them some music. But the fact of the matter is that what? Music is prohibited in Islam. Like any other, and singing as well, if we're talking about a cappella singing, but the way that the people do it with the rising and falling of the octaves and all that, that's also prohibited in Islam. طيب, تفضل الشيخ.
If you don't mind, inshallah. Since we are not going to be here Monday, if it's possible, maybe we'd like to keep the good habit. Having the class, we can, inshallah, try to make a substitute for this day.
Jay, that would be even better.
If not, I maybe take it myself.
Okay.
I want to be able to stay
consistent.
Yeah.
Jazakallah khair,
If you don't mind now.
Yes, I don't mind at all. I prefer consistency. I just didn't want to trouble you, Sheikh, to be honest with you. But yes, so we will have class, and there will be a substitute, one way or the other, inshallah. By hook or by crook. So just forget what I said about no class next week. Next week, 7 o'clock, be here. There will be class, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. Have any other questions, comments, or critiques before we close? Going once? Going twice? Tafadhal, Muhammad, yes?
I was just curious, but so the start of the class is at 7?
7, yes, sir. Yeah, we said that 2 weeks ago. And then on the 13th, not this week, but next week, it'll be Maghrib. Because we won't have time. It'll be, 7:15, 7:20 will be Maghrib. So if we start at 7, as soon as I say, in alhamdulillah, it'll be over. SubhanAllah. Any other questions, comments, critiques? Going once, going twice? Gone. هذا وصلى الله وسلم وبارك محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.